There were two Americans hanged for war crimes in the aftermath of the American Civil War, Henry Wurz and Champ Ferguson. Here are their stories. Henry Wurz was born in Switzerland in 1823 and was forced to immigrate out of Switzerland by the Swiss government in 1848 for the crime of failing to pay a debt. He first went to Russia and a year later to the United States, where he found a job in a factory in Lawrence, Massachusetts. In 1854, Wirz married a widow with two daughters, and they moved to Louisiana. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, the 37-year-old enlisted as a private in the Louisiana Infantry of the Confederate Army. In June of 1862, Wurz was promoted to captain for bravery on the field of battle. He was subsequently assigned to the staff of General John Winder, who was in charge of Confederate prisoner of war camps. Wurz was placed in charge of a Confederate prisoner of war camp in Alabama and also served at a camp in Richmond, Virginia. In February 1864, the government of the Confederacy established a large prisoner of war camp called Camp Sumter in the small town of Anderson in southwest Georgia. Wurz was appointed as commandant of that camp. The camp became known as Andersonville, a name coined by the prisoners. Although Andersonville was only operational for around 14 months, it became infamous for its extreme overcrowding, lack of food, medical supplies, and potable water. In short, the conditions were squalid and basically unfit for human habitation. The prisoners were not afforded indoor barracks and lived outside year-round. At its peak, Camp Sumter held 32,000 prisoners, which equated to each one occupying approximately a 5-foot by 6-foot piece of ground. The monthly mortality rate due to disease, dysentery, and malnutrition reached around 3,000 dead at its peak. The 45,000 prisoners that were at one time or another incarcerated during the 14-month existence of the camp, 13,000 died, a death rate of almost 30%. At the conclusion of the war in 1865, the 4th U.S. Cavalry arrested Captain Wurz. He was subsequently incarcerated in Washington, D.C. on May 10, 1865, in the old Capitol Prison, and the federal government charged him with war crimes committed against the Union prisoners at Andersonville. A military trial was held to prosecute Wurz, and Major General Lew Wallace presided over the proceedings. The military tribunal took place from August 23rd through October 18th, 1865, and was front-page material in newspapers across the United States. Wurz was charged with, quote, confining, confederating, and conspiring to injure the health and destroy the lives of soldiers in the military service of the United States, end quote. He was accused of committing 13 acts of personal cruelty and murder. There were 158 witnesses questioned at the trial, of which only 13 testified to first-hand knowledge of acts of cruelty by Captain Wurz. Some historians have theorized that Wurz was a victim of the fact that the Confederacy was incapable of providing proper care of war prisoners due to the lack of available resources at that point in the war, and that he was the scapegoat. Ultimately, Wirz was convicted of war crimes and sentenced to hang. On November 10, 1865, he was hanged in the old Capitol prison. His neck did not break from the fall, and witnesses saw him writhe and slowly strangled. Henry Wurz was buried in the Mount Olivet Cemetery in Washington, D.C. The other person arrested and executed for war crimes was named Champ Ferguson. He was a notorious guerrilla who perpetrated his deeds against Union forces and Union sympathizers in the eastern part of Tennessee. Champ Ferguson was the oldest of 10 children and was born November 29, 1821, in Clinton County, Kentucky, close to the Tennessee border. He earned a reputation for violence even before the Civil War. An altercation in 1858 led to a fight in which Ferguson fatally stabbed the acting constable of Fentress County, Tennessee, and stabbed and severely wounded Floyd Evans, with whom he had an ongoing feud. He was never convicted of the murder and stabbing, and soon moved to White County, Tennessee, to avoid potential arrest and conviction. During the Civil War, the eastern part of Tennessee was mostly opposed to secession. That was due to the area being mountainous and not being particularly suited to agriculture on a large scale, and thus few slave owners in the area. The central and western parts of Tennessee had more of an agricultural-based economy and more slaves and slave owners. That part of Tennessee was much more aligned with the Confederacy. That historical divide in Tennessee led to many informal engagements between troops of both sides, as well as civilian sympathizers of each side. There were even significant skirmishes between Confederate troops and local partisan Union sympathizers far from the front. The mountainous terrain and lack of law enforcement in eastern Tennessee gave guerrillas and other irregular military units significant leeway for unregulated action. Champ Ferguson organized and led a guerrilla force and attacked and killed civilians he believed supported the Union. His men cooperated with and sometimes coordinated with Confederate regular army troops. Ferguson's men were not subject to military discipline and often violated common rules of war. At the end of the war, Ferguson disbanded his men and returned to his home near Sparta, Tennessee. Upon hearing of Ferguson's whereabouts, Union troops arrested him and took him to Nashville to face trial for war crimes to include 53 murders. He acknowledged that his band had killed many of the victims named in his indictment and said he had killed over 100 himself. In October 1865, Ferguson was found guilty and sentenced to hang for his crimes. Champ Ferguson was hanged on October 20th, 1865, and was buried in the France Cemetery north of Sparta, Tennessee. If you enjoyed this video, give a thumbs up, click on the bell for notifications of future videos, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. As always, thanks for watching.